Hi, good evening, everyone. Glad that you could join us, that you could join me this evening. So nice to see you all again. We are going to be moving on to chapter 4 of Tehillim, the fourth psalm. Before we do that, as has become customary, we're going to discuss something related to the 7 Noahide laws. Today, I decided to talk about prayer and how that fits into the 7 Noahide laws. And, you know, a little bit of the substance of prayer and a little bit of what prayer is about. The reason for this is because this chapter, so much of its theme, right at the beginning, refers to prayer. If you look at verse 2, in Hebrew it says, Bakari aneni Elokei tzidki, batzar hichabta li, chaneni ushma tfilatzi. Answer me when I call, O God, who knows my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. So, in two different ways, King David here is talking about prayer. First he says, Bakari aneni, answer me when I call. And then at the end he says, hear my prayer. So the two references to prayer, and obviously, I mean, what are we doing here? What is all of Tehillim about? All of Psalms is really prayer, isn't it? It's all David communicating with God. It's all Israel communicating with God and other tzaddikim and righteous people, and their communication and expression of their feelings to God, their relationship with God. So it seemed so appropriate to take the time and talk about prayer and how that fits in to the Noahide laws. I mean, prayer seems so incredibly fundamental to faith, so incredibly fundamental to belief in God. But let's get it down in its details. Let's talk about it from a halachic perspective and define it a little bit. So first of all, I always ask, what are our sources? Is there a source for prayer for the Noahide, for the Bnei Noach? So there are two different sources, and those two different sources reflect two different categories of prayer. The first is Yonah again. If you look in the book of Jonah, it discusses when the city of Nineveh was repenting, when they were made aware of the decree against them of the destruction of the city. And it states there as follows. And I'm looking here in chapter 3, it's verse 8. Both man and animal shall cover themselves with sackcloth. So that's referring to a form of mourning and fasting and so on. Then it says, and they shall call out mightily to God. So they're calling out to God. That's a form of prayer. They're communicating, they're reaching out. I mean, calling out, what does it mean exactly when we call out? When you call to your friend, when you call to your spouse, they may be in another room, they may be a little far away, and you need to raise your voice and get their attention. So that's calling out. There's a form of person who feels distant. Person may be in a place of suffering, in a difficult situation where they feel distant from God, and they're calling out as if, you know, God is in a faraway place and trying to reach him. There's an effort involved in it also. And they're calling, so to speak, his attention. So that's a reference to prayer. Now, the other reference is in Psalm 117. It says, Hallelujah Hashem kol goyim, shavchu kol ha'umim. Praise the Lord, all you nations, extol him, all you peoples. So I saw that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a great halachic authority of the 20th century, he was asked the question of where's the source for Noahide prayer, and he said it's this verse. This verse, it says that the nations will praise God. And there's also, obviously, there's the other verse that the temple will be a house of prayer for all the nations. So you see implicitly that prayer refers to all the nations. But why the two verses? And why do I bring up the two verses? So there's a form of prayer that is when we're in need, when we're suffering, when we have a problem, when we're in anguish. So we're calling out for help. Okay, so that's one form of prayer. The other form of prayer is praise, and it's just about communion. It's about connecting and building a bridge between the person and God. So those are the two types of prayer. So if we have to connect it to a main root from the 7 laws, which one would it be? Which one would prayer be connected to? I think it's quite obvious that it's connected to the law of Noah, that the nations are forbidden to be involved and engage in any idol worship. What's the connection? The connection is that it's forbidden to pray and seek out anyone else, to seek out another power. So that means, in other words, if a person doesn't pray to God, if a person doesn't turn to God when in distress, it implies that they believe that there's some other power that can help them. So in that way, it's a kind of a minuscule form, a kind of a shadow of idolatry in that way. Because if a person believed in God, then when they're in distress, they turn to him for help. If a person doesn't do that, then it implies they don't believe God can help them. So therefore, the main root there is as idolatry. And obviously, the other side of idolatry is belief in God. Is that a person has to believe that God is really the only power and the source of all being and existence in the universe. And that being the case, obviously, when a person has a need, they need to turn to God in order to find an answer to that need, to whatever needs that they may have. At the same time, though, there's also within that is intertwined the fact that there is a communication with God. I mean, God kind of should become a person's therapist. Whenever a person has a certain stress, when a person has a certain need, when something is on the person's heart, they should turn and speak to God about that problem. Because certainly there's no one who's closer, there's no one who really loves them more than God. The way I thought about it recently was, who is the one that gains nothing, who's perfect and has nothing to gain from the relationship with man? It's only his creator, who is already infinite and complete and has no need for any interaction with another, and yet gives to us. In a certain sense, that's a kind of a perfection of love. It's a true altruism. It's not an altruism based on a need to feel good, a need to connect to another, because at the end of the day, a lot of the altruism that human beings exercise, in essence, is really a need to connect to another. And that's not a bad thing, but it's just not a pure altruism. So if we meditate on that idea, we realize that, God creates us ex nihilo at every moment, creates us from nothing, and he keeps all the laws of nature and vivifies us and gives us life at every moment and sustains us. That's a real form of love, like a parent, like a mother, that we have that relationship with him. And in the same way that a human being's love and feeling is limited by their finite existence. In other words, there's only so much love that I can feel, otherwise I'm going to burst. I can only hold in so much emotion, otherwise I'm not going to be able to function. But God, on the other hand, he's infinite, and his definition is infinite. So the amount of love that he has for us is also infinite, and so valuable for a person really to think about this and meditate on that sometimes in times when we're not in the best of places, and realize that this is a real truth, and that we're never alone. So in any event, but still, the point is that when we're in distress, when we need to call out, when we want to communicate something that's bothering us and on our chest, we should communicate with him. And that's something that is for every single human being, everyone that's created in God's image. And God wants that. And that's what's also so fascinating. And actually, I saw a midrash on that in regards to this particular chapter of Psalms. It brings out this point and says, look how God is different from all the kings of the world and all the, we say in Yiddish, I don't know if you ever heard this expression, all the machers. Have you ever heard of that macher? A big macher? Anyway, so, usually a big macher is someone you want to talk to him, you got to go see his secretary, you got to make an appointment, and then you'll probably see his assistant, and you have to call back a few times, you got to wait, for half a year. But no, God isn't that way. He wants to hear from us. He wants to have a meeting with us. That's an incredible humility and really an incredible love. It's an incredible thing that he wants the relationship with us, even though we're so meaningless, we're so small, and we're so vulnerable. But he wants that. So, that just teaches us also so much about ourselves, so much about what it means to imitate God. In other words, maybe we're in a place or a moment where we're feeling really impatient, and it's just the kids are driving us crazy, or our spouse or someone else, and we really just don't feel like giving them our ear right now, and it may be helpful to think about, if I do give them the time, that I'm emulating God at that moment, and that I have a certain divinity about me at that moment. I have a certain level of nobility, that I'm actually emulating him. And you can use that as a moment to connect, to really to turn that into a spiritual moment. That might help. That might help turn things around. In other words, the point is, it's not, oh, I'm just giving, I'm taking away from myself. You're actually broadening yourself. You're actually becoming more of the inner divine self than you can be. And that's a very important way and helpful way for us to strengthen ourselves when it gets tough to really, give an ear and give time to others. So the verse in Yonah talks about crying out in a time of crisis. So that's the source that for the nations calling out to God in a time of crisis. I wanted to add that Nachmanides, the Ramban, and Maimonides, they argue about, for Israel at least, whether there's a commandment of prayer and what exactly is the structure of the commandment for prayer. And Maimonides says it's if I got this correctly, I think Maimonides says it's rabbinic. And Nachmanides says it's biblical. But in any event, Nachmanides says, as we said, that we see throughout the Bible, throughout the history in Genesis, that human beings cried out to God in a time of crisis, and that's part of faith. And if a person doesn't do that, it clearly shows a lack of faith. But again, to come at it from that angle, I think is a mistake. It's not like, well, if I don't do that, I'm lacking faith. But it's a tremendous, tremendous support to a person to know that they're not alone, that Hashem wants to hear us, and that he wants to hear what we have to say. Someone once said, he doesn't always give us the answer we want to hear, but he listens, and that's important too. We need to have, it's so much, in this generation, people have to pay, top dollar to go to therapists for someone to listen to us. And I think if we acclimate ourselves to really believe and to really set it as a fact in our minds that God is listening, and to make a communication with him, and to open up a conversation, that's a form of therapy. It's a real form of therapy with someone who actually wants to listen and is not looking at the clock to see when the 45 minutes is over and they get their check. So it's a really, really powerful and valuable thing, and we're never alone. That's another lesson of the mitzvah of prayer, is that a person's never alone. That God is always there. His ear he's always with us. And when we have a crisis or we are struggling with something, He is there. He is there with us. We just have to reach out to try to seek the strength that we have within us, within our own spirit. That's the thing. Though that's the way that he bridges with us. In Jacob's dream the other week of the ladder, which actually it's said that the ladder actually ascended from heaven and then came down below, and the angels they went up and down from the ladder. But the ladder, clearly demonstrated something that's so incredibly profound, and that is that there's a connection between the divine, between the spiritual and the physical. They're not cut off from each other. That's one of the clear messages. And that not only that, but they're angels coming up from above. In other words, that our actions have an effect, that we are doing something that's creating angels that are going back up. That was the image that Jacob saw. That's the power. That's really the power of prayer. Power of prayer is that we can actually change things. I think I mentioned this in a previous class, that a blessing opens up a conduit to a source already existing in the heavenly spiritual realms, to bring down from a certain wellspring that already exists of vitality. But prayer opens up new forms of blessing, or new forms of vitality and enlightenment that may not have even existed before. So that's an incredible thing. Now, the second verse, the Hallelu Kol Goyim, the praise that all the nations will praise God, that's a second form of prayer. Now, the second form of prayer is very existential. What I mean by that is, for us to honestly praise, it has to come from within. The first type of prayer is reactionary. It's the most basic. A person suffering, looking for help. Person has a sense to realize that, that a person is very deficient and very vulnerable and should turn to the Creator for help. So, but in the end of the day, it is kind of self-serving. The person has a problem and wants help with the problem. So, but the second form really more belies the relationship and reflects the love the person has for God. It's related to love and fear of God, as Maimonides speaks about. And this is also related to this command of belief in God. The nations are also advised, commanded. It's certainly an offshoot. It's a hidur mitzvah. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but it's a beautification and of the mitzvah of belief in God, to really work on that mitzvah. And by the way, in this sense, I actually kind of envy, the Noahide. And the reason for that is you can stick to basics. You can stick on your relationship with God. In other words, there's so many of the ritual laws of Judaism which Jews have to do in order to keep the world going with all its spiritual mechanics, with the lulav and esrog and the certain prayer times and the tefillin and all these things. And it's a lot of things you have to do. Sometimes there's not a lot of time to think about what you're doing. And you may, your job, shul, the kids, there's a lot going on there. You have the advantage of really sticking to the basics, really sticking to faith, really sticking to contemplating God, really taking a stroll in the field and contemplating creation, contemplating providence, and also contemplating the history of Israel and how that affects the world, and God's, historical plan, and all these things, and really, really thinking about it, and really also thinking about your lives and how providence, exercises itself in your own life. And the result of that is prayer. The result of that. And also the result of the love. I mean, as Maimonides explains, he says that when a person contemplates the world and the wisdom, and the beauty of nature and the universe, a person becomes full of awe and also full of love. And I think the basis, to a great extent, though, is recognition, a person recognizing all the gifts. It's a very difficult thing in our generation because we just take so much for granted. And, we live in a very kind of exploitive world where, human beings have so much, where we're able to exploit nature so much, and we're not really aware that it's not just coming to us, and it's not just, it's just so easy. You push this button, you go to the store, and things just, it's hard to recognize all the wonderful gifts that we have and really in the basic things of life. So that's really your job. You all have homework. Your homework is to work on your relationship with God, and to work on your love and fear of God. That's your homework. And to work on that relationship and to really make him, your a father, a mother, a friend. I don't know. I often think of God as a friend. I often think of God as, a king friend. Someone that he's powerful. He's watching over me, but he's very intimately close. He's somebody that, I walk with. Someone that's always with me. It's like the closest and closest of friends. If that's a helpful metaphor for you, I would use it. Of course, it's the truth. So the question is, the thing is imagination is also important, and to take the facts and turn those facts into feelings. So important because our soul is deeply bound up in emotion. It's deeply bound up in who we are is deeply bound up in our feelings, which actually brings me to the next point, which is that the beginning of this chapter begins with music, right? So the first prefatory sentence here in verse is La Menatzeach Beneginos Mizmar LeDavid, which in my Tehillim here is translated for the conductor with instrumental music, a psalm of David. In most commentaries, the word La Menatzeach means for the musician. So I don't know what's your translation. I'm not sure where they got the word conductor from, as I didn't see that in any commentaries. But it means a musician, and the niginot or niginos is a musical instrument. And Rashi tells us that this was a musical instrument that was played in the temple, in the Beis Hamikdash. And this particular psalm was sung by the Levites in the temple during the services. So that's really something. This is a special psalm. It's not the only one that was sung in the temple, no. But this is something that, this is a really special psalm. But the question is, why music? What place does music have with prayer? And I think that gets back to what I was saying before, is that well, it stimulates emotion. I mean, what stimulates emotion more than music does? I mean, the amazing thing like music is that, you can, it's kind of like in a bad movie. I mean, if you have good music, then they try to, if there's bad acting and good music, it isn't quite as bad. It's just not as terrible. So, that's the power of music. It's an incredible vehicle to build emotion. And you can say that King David, of righteous memory, that he communicated not just with the words here, but there was a tune, evidently, unfortunately now lost, but there was a particular tune that they sang with this psalm that went along with it. And so there's a mysterious side to this psalm, where it's not just words, it's not just reduced to reason and an idea, but there's feelings there. There's something that goes way beyond, that we're meant to connect to. And certainly in Judaism, we see again and again this concept. As a Jew, we need to read it twice a day in the Shema. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your heart, with all your life, or your soul, with all your might. And it is a perplexing verse because, how can you tell someone to love? And actually the commentators discuss this. Again, and those who are anti-religious, I'm sure, will say things like, this is sadistic. You're telling someone to love, pointing a gun at someone else's head and telling them to love. This is absurd. What's great about many of the, Rav Kook said this, and some Hasidic rabbis also said this, that, there's a place for heretics, or say it a different way, in a more precise way. Heresy has a holy source, and the holy source is that sometimes there's attention needed, in order for us to come to truth. It is a valid question. What is the meaning of telling someone to love? And I believe that this is one of the teachings, is that actually the way we need to read this verse is we need to read it in a drama. We need to read it as part of a love story. And God is saying, please love me like I love you. That's how it should be read. I think that's the meaning of the verse. Of course, like a spouse, is it, in other words, yes, you better love me, because when someone really loves you, they insist on your love. That's how it works. And as it says, it says in the Ten Commandments, God is a jealous God. What's the meaning of that jealousy? What kind of a thing is that? Again, the anti-religious point to this as some type of sadism or cruelty, God forbid. But the point is that God's love is so deep and so necessary, which is really bizarre, which is really astounding, I should say, that God should have such a love for the Jewish people, that He's so disturbed, like two lovers, like someone who is in love, or more so a spouse, really, that becomes angry when the other spouse betrays them. This is a sign of a very, very deep love. So, I don't know, I've been reading the verse twice a day to tell me that what God is saying, I want you to love me a little bit like I love you. I think you really have to, because how else can you, otherwise it's unfair. And isn't God just? Doesn't He always talk of justice? How could He ask us to do something He doesn't do? So the answer is no. He obligates Himself to love us. And therefore, He's obligating us to love Him. And if we do that, His obligation comes out. By the way, that's also a major fundamental rule in Jewish spirituality and Jewish teachings, is that there is a mirror. Kamayim, there's the expression in the verse, Kamayim panim el panim. Like when a person looks in the water and sees his face, and whatever he does, he sees that reflection in the water. So too, God is like a reflection. And again, isn't this so much like any relationship? With someone where there's a deep love, there is a type of reflection. If a person acts in a way with their spouse where they, even in the very slightest way, they show a certain coldness, what happens? That could be very destructive, even just a little bit. So now, when we think about the relationship between God and Israel, and we read the verse in the Shema, in the second chapter, where it says that Hishamru lachem, pen yivtel avchem v'sartem. He said, beware, watch yourselves very carefully, lest you turn away, and then you worship other gods. And, some of the Hasidic masters talk about this idea. If you turn away, that's already bad. Once you turn away, you're going to end up worshiping other gods. Why? Because of what I'm saying. Because the relationship is so intense that if the Jew turns away, then that's already a little bit turning away. That already could cause a ripple effect of damage, which is very harmful. But nevertheless, all these things, again, because Israel is a paradigm for all mankind. So to whatever extent these things are more intense by Israel, but everybody can connect to this. This is not only for Israel. Everyone can connect to this idea. And every human being is created in God's image. And Israel is made to be a paradigm for, as an example for mankind to understand what the relationship could be like. And so that the nations, you can opt in. You can opt in, and to how deep, to what extent, really is your own choosing. It's your own choosing. That's the bottom line. There's a minimum of not rebelling, which is the minimum of the 7 laws. But as far as to what degree you're ready to sacrifice, to what degree you're ready to make God the focus in your life, is your choice. Make the choice. Make the choice to make it more. Make the choice to do a little more, and to make God, and make it, make yourself into a David. A neat feel, I am prayer, where your whole life is like a prayer. And this could be a tikkun really for the nations, because we find that one of the bad character traits of the nations is arrogance, where it says about Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, and many examples are brought in the Talmud of them speaking that, vanquishing God and calling themselves a deity and so on and so forth. Or even other leaders who nobody does it like me, and so on and so forth. And so, but no, I'm very, very serious about that. Israel is seen as the paradigm of humility. And this really has to also affect us in our service of God also. There's a way to be holy, whereas you're really not holy. I mean, this could be for Jew or non-Jew. It's the same, but we find a certain, I think there's a certain behavioral pattern that often people who are turned off from, other religions find. Maybe even people who, God forbid, may experience this, within Judaism, God forbid. But there's a feeling people get where people are holy rollers, where they use religion to boost their ego. Look how holy I am. Look how God spoke to me. God told me this. God told me the other thing. I'm God's emissary. I'm God's messenger to the whole world, and so on and so forth. And it's not. This isn't the Jewish way. This isn't the way. To make proclamations about God speaking to us, and this is not our way. The way is with humility, through doing and feeling, and the way a person shows how they're close to God is by praising God. What did Jacob say when Jacob came last week's parsha? When Isaac said to him, "Wow, you really came quick. How did you catch that game so quickly?" He didn't say, "Ha ha, me, I'm the best. What are you talking about? I'm the best hunter out there. Nobody's like me." No, he didn't say that. He said, "Oh, this is because, God presented it before me. I was able to give it to you." So, and we see that again and again, that the patriarchs always attributed their success to God. That's the key. That's the key Jewish trait. And there's no monopoly on this. This is for everyone. But the point is, this could be a fantastic way to bring about a tikkun for the nations, to really connect to that idea and to really make sure that we really thank God in a real way, not to show how holy we are, but to really believe it with humility, that the blessings that we have, the strength and the talents and so on and so forth that the nations have comes from God. But again, so it's really the thing is that faith and prayer go together. The stronger the person's faith, the stronger and more intense the prayer. I go to synagogue, I open the prayer book, and I close my eyes and I really try to focus, and that's wonderful. It's important. It is. But the thing is that if I didn't, during the day, or during all the years of my life up till now, I didn't work on faith, and I didn't think about the fact that what's going on in my life is providence, then it's going to be don't expect your prayer to be like a flame and a fire, because you're really, it's a moment of self-expression. So if you're there, you can be there. Of course, prayer is also a time of meditation. It's a time of a person divorcing themselves from the material and making proclamations that, yes, everything is from you. And when you say the verses, you can strengthen that. And I think it's so important to meditate on what the verses in prayer say and what the verses in Psalms say. It's a time to build faith. It's a time to build palaces of faith for oneself during prayer. I think that's one of really the main accomplishments of prayer, is to do that, to say the verses and the words of praise, and to think this is true and this is true and this is true. And I believe this with perfect faith. When you do that, and then after you go through all the chapters that talk about praise in the organization of the prayer book, and then you get to asking for the various needs, you're in a different place already, because you're also already a person of faith, at least to some extent, through your efforts over the past few minutes of really meditating on what you've said. I mean, there isn't a verse that you can't really spend a very long time thinking about. Just one thinking about that we really believe it, because we live in a world where we don't really believe it, where as soon as something goes, what are we going to do to fix it? We have to do this, we have to do that, we have to do the other. And look, I'm not saying we don't, but we forget the fact that as a Jew, I believe in perfect faith that if we fix one problem, another problem will arise. I guarantee you can't escape God. And that he knew long ago that man is going to come up with this vaccine and this thing, and he has other ways. There's nothing, you can't smart your way out of problems. There will be another problem. And I know many of you have probably studied the Derech Hashem, paths of God, and understand a little bit of Jewish traditional philosophy. And that's it. The answer is to repentance. The answer is to spiritual things. Of course, we do have to seek physical means, just like in the verse says in Exodus and Parshat Mishpatim, that a person is hurt, they have to seek a doctor and heal. This is true, but in reality, we know that that's not the end of the story. That if we don't seek to repent and to think about what's gone wrong, what can I do, then the problems will get worse. And also, of course, that we must learn something from what's going on in our life. That clearly there must be some good purpose and meaning in it. It's not for nothing. And I have to try to learn what it's all about. Music, is a way to really, it speaks to the soul. It ennobles a person. It also etches things in our memory. Music has the tendency it sticks in our mind. There's a tune, we remember it. And I think this particular psalm, David wanted it to be remembered. And I think the reason for that, according to the Malbim, works out very well. And this psalm talks about how God heard David's prayer. And again, we see a certain sequence. And it seems to repeat itself in Psalms very often, where David talks about people who are mocking him, who seem to be pursuing him, he's alienated. He's alienated. It seems that there are many people that humiliate him. He's getting a lot of bad CNN press. He's just there. He has a lot of human interaction problems. I mean, first with Saul, and there's a lot of people among Saul that are spies against him, that slander him to Saul, Then he has the problems with Avshalom. And then there's finally the problem that the Malbim tells us is this chapter is speaking about. And that is something that's found at the end of Samuel 2 in chapter 21. And that is the story of the fact that there was a famine in the land of Israel for 3 years. 3 years there was a famine while David was king. So what do you think happens? Everybody blames the president, right? So everybody blamed the king, that it was his fault. And but different than today, in those days they said, because of your sin, because you and Bathsheba, because what happened to Bathsheba, because of that sin, and you're the king, that's why there's a famine, because of what you've done. And you're kind of like, you're irredeemable. And we talked about before in the previous chapter where there's this idea that many believe that David couldn't be redeemed, that his sin was just too great, and God wouldn't forgive him. So what happens here is that they ask the Urim and Thummim, they get a message from the prophet or a message from the priest through the breastplate, that the reason for the famine had nothing to do with King David. It actually had to do with the sin of Saul. And here's another interesting interplay between the nations and Israel. Take a look at the chapter, very interesting. It says that the prophecy said the reason for the famine is because the sin of Shaul that he struck, he annihilated the Gibeonites. Because of that, there's been a famine. So who are these Gibeonites? These Gibeonites, it's a story in Joshua where they were Hittites. And they were supposed to be driven out from the land or liquidated. And they come and they deceive the people, they deceive Joshua into believing that they're from a faraway land and can we please live here? And so Joshua and the people have compassion on them and they make an oath, a covenant, promising not to harm them. And then they find out that it actually was not true. But nevertheless, the covenant is kept because a promise is a promise even if it's made by mistake. And also because it would be a desecration of the name of God. They made a vow in God's name, and they're not going to violate that vow. So the Gibeonites live in the land of Canaan, in the land of Israel, and they live evidently next to priestly cities, because there's some land there in between the inherited lands of the tribes, and they lived in these areas that were inhabited by the priests, by the Kohanim. They did some business with the priests, evidently. They did some work for the priests. They lived there. Now, the story is that the city of Nob, they gave refuge to David when he was fleeing Saul. Saul was notified about this again by people who told Lashon Hara, who slandered and gave bad news, so to speak. They told Saul, and Saul took this as a rebellion against his kingdom, and he slaughtered all the priests in that particular city. So there's difference of opinions here, whether he also slaughtered the Gibeonites who were there as supporting them, or whether there's an opinion in the Talmud that wasn't the case, but they lost their livelihood because this is where they lived, and now they couldn't make a living, and so they starved or suffered greatly from that. So the prophet calls the house of Saul the house of blood for this act of what they did to the Gibeonites, and there needed to be an atonement. And it's a difficult story. So King David approaches the Gibeonites and tries to get their forgiveness. And the verse says that the Gibeonites are not from the children of Israel. And then it goes on to say that they wouldn't forgive. And David tried to offer them various gifts. Is there anything they refused? They said, we want 7 from the house of Saul. We want to execute 7 from the house of Saul in revenge. That's all they would accept. And this is the interesting part, and I don't have an answer to this because it seems quite bizarre, but David hands over 7 from the house of Saul and they are hanged by the Gibeonites. Afterwards, it says that David went there to collect their remains, including also the remains of Saul and Jonathan that were also still that were still laid out in a dishonorable fashion somewhere by the Philistines. And he gathered all these remains and he gave them an honorable burial. That's the story. The point is that David felt very much here that he had been vindicated, that the fact that the prophet said this had nothing to do with him was a vindication of the fact that this wasn't because of his sin, that God had forgave him for his sin, and this was due to something completely separate, had no relationship to him. So it's a very personal song. It really meant a lot to him, but also I think it was a national story. It wasn't a personalized story. It was a story that was nationalized, and it was memorialized in this psalm and put as part of the temple service. So I think according to the Malbim, this works out very well. Other commentaries understand that this chapter is talking about, when it refers to verse 3, B'nei ish admech vodi lichlima tehavun rik tevakshu chazav sala. Sons of men, how long will you turn my honor to shame? Will you love vanity and endlessly seek falsehood? Some say it's talking about, as I said, the slanderers who approached Saul. Some say it was the slanderers who approached Absalom. But I think the Malbim is a very nice and fitting approach. There's a lot to say on this particular chapter. What I said today about the mitzvah and prayer and then music was an introduction. I think I'm going to take some time today to talk about one more subject in depth for the next 10 or so minutes. And then next week we'll get into the actual text and we'll apply the concepts to the text. And maybe I can come up with some other ideas for next week to also, just bring out some more substance as well next week. But I wanted to talk about one more idea, which relates to what we spoke up till now. And that is that this entire, chapter and really, the chapters, the second chapter, well, particularly the third and the fourth chapters here are clearly very personal. They're about David's life. When he's talking about, his own distress and suffering that he's going through, and he went through, and then his vindications and the way that he was saved from those things. And these are things that are memorialized forever, as songs that for everyone, and for the Jewish people, became part of the Bible, part of Tanakh. I think it's a very powerful, profound idea that things that were personal to our forefathers, they're eternal. And I was thinking about that this week also in terms of the stories of the patriarchs, because, they're very, they're not superhero stories, they're not action movies, they're not Greek mythology, lahavdil. In other words, what I'm saying is they're not stories of, superhuman bravery and, vanquishing of monsters. But what's interesting also is they're not even exactly tzaddikim stories. They're not stories of like Hasidic saints either. You don't really see a lot of miracles, and you don't even see it's interesting because, often stories of saints in Judaism, the way it was brought up in yeshivas, a lot of it is about, fasting, living in poverty, studying Torah day and night. Or how about this? Or, just giving charity almost until, people didn't have any money in their own pocket. Really, things that are, you could say almost superhuman, really. That, touching on the super sacrifice. So the really special. But the story of the patriarchs that the Torah tells us, for some reason, besides the fact that God spoke to them, doesn't seem that out of the ordinary. It seems a little bizarre. It's because most of the stories about their saintliness are part of the oral tradition, but they're not in the written Bible, and you kind of wonder, why is that? Why the stories, this past Sabbath, this past Shabbos, story of Jacob and raising a family and working very hard and making an honest living, the difficulties he had with a deceitful employer. These are very things that everyone in their own life has to deal with. These aren't things that are like out there, like something, it's something that you only see in a movie or something. These are our lives. This is everyone's lives, and the spouses fighting, and Rachel and Leah, there was a jealousy there, and Jacob had to deal with it. He had to deal with it, and his wife was just like, Rachel was so upset that she wasn't having children, and Yaakov was just like, what do you want from me? It's not my fault, and it's just it's a story of people, it's a story of people, and although our sages tell us that it was so much more, and obviously we have to know that it was. God spoke to them, and we see time and again that, like at the end of, and that's what's so amazing about last week's parsha, is that it ends on this unbelievable, transcendental, heavenly note where Jacob meets the angels. It's just an amazing thing, and that's really what Judaism is. Judaism is like 1 minute. You with the guy, 1 minute you're doing business and you're talking to your wife. The next minute you're talking to an angel. That's basically what Judaism is all about. It's like you live your life as a person, and you need to juggle both. You need to be 1 moment in reality here and dealing with the real stories of life. How to be honest with a difficult employer, how to soothe your wife when she's in suffer and struggling. How to build a family, build a nation, based on values. That's what they were doing. They wanted to fulfill this concept. They all knew that the children of Israel, the Jewish people, would come from their family, and they wanted to do it. They wanted to get it done. The wives, they wanted to have these children, and it meant so much to them. That's what you see, and that because of that, it developed into a bit of a rivalry. But that's natural. It was for a good purpose, but then problems arose. So, the love of Jacob and Rachel. So the point is this, simply. The point is this, is that it's all connected to prayer. The point is, whatever we do from life, we're simultaneously here, but we're also right next to the ladder at the same time. It's not far away. It's right with us at the same time. What I mean to say is that, like I said, God is with us constantly. We're face to face with God. So whatever's happening to us, we think about it in relation to Him. We think about both what are we supposed to do, what's the message we're supposed to have, and how does it, we're affected. It's our story is God telling our story. He's the narrator in our story. It's not someone else's story. It's our story. And that's what the Tehillim is trying to tell us. David lived that. He lived that deeply. His life, he sang that to God. He cried that out. That's what prayer is all about. Prayer means my life, I understand my life is about the fact that you're involved with me. That's what prayer means. It's not something, I do once a week, for cake and coffee or whatever. It's part of my social life or whatever it is. It's something that is part of my consciousness all the time. There's an awareness that He's there. It's funny because, I haven't heard about this recently, but children, sometimes psychologically, they develop an imaginary friend. But maybe that's what that's about. Is that we have an invisible friend who's always there with us. And He's part of our story. He also feels our pain too. The Talmud says that when a person stubs their toe or has a pain, that God feels the pain too. God also feels the pain. But here's the interesting thing. He feels it worse than we do because He can. We can only bear so much. but the full brunt of what we should be bearing, he feels it. He feels it because his connection with us. You know, he's so connected. You know, we can't connect with others the way he can because we can't bear it. You know, if we connect too much, we can't help. We'll be brought down by other people's problems. But he can. He can feel that. And that, again, there's something to meditate on, something to think about. That not only is he with us, but he feels what we're going through, you know, more than we feel what we're going through, even to that extent. And of course, it has to bring us to the realization that clearly it must be for my good in some way. He wouldn't let this happen unless there's something that ultimately this is really deeply for me. This is for my neshama. You know, this is deeply good for me somehow, because he doesn't want to bring pain to himself. I mean, it's like a parent. As a mother or a father who want to hurt their child, they're doing it because they have to. They wouldn't do it otherwise. They have to do it for the child's own good, and it's painful to them to do it when they're doing it, but they have to do it. And that's real love. So that's what all of Tehillim is, and that's what we're going to see again and again. It's a personal story, but it's a story that's always being told together with God, not separate. It's a story that's being told that it's where at every moment we're talking to God about it. You know, where there's a problem, we cry out. If things go well, we praise and we're happy and we tell him about it. You know, because he's our parent and he's our friend that's always with us. And that's really who King David was. And that's probably why his name was David, because David means beloved. You know, Yedidya, and there's an element of intimacy in his name. So he had that relationship with God, that there was an intimacy wherever he was involved with. And he was human. His feelings, the way he felt, he did feel. But the thing was, that very feeling was so deeply intertwined with his relationship with God that he continued to ascend. And even when he went down, he ascended even higher than others did because of that reason, because of that very reason. That when he went down, when he came down low, he cried out louder. That's something other people didn't do. In other words, you know, people who were like Saul he was horizontal, and suddenly he just dipped. From his shoulders and above, there was nobody like him. In other words, he was exceptional, believe it or not. Saul was really exceptional, spiritually. And as a person, he really had tremendous qualities. But with that can come a certain complacency. From that can come, you know, you don't have to work hard because you're already there enough. You don't feel forced. You know, if someone has to struggle with their evil inclination in Judaism, you know, somebody's struggling with lust, anger, laziness, whatever it is. So again, it's a faith. It has to do with faith. So one person, you know, you can fall to God forbid a person could fall to the very depths because they have this evil inclination. And so they try to on their own deal with it, and they can't. They can't deal with it, and then they're angry at God. Why did you give me these commandments and everything? I can't do it. If I can't do it, then you're unfair. But you forgot the main ingredient. You're supposed to turn to God for help. You know, you're supposed to feel the distance. If you felt the distance and you cried out for help, and if you felt distance from your beloved and you wanted to come close, believe me, you'd solve all problems. But the thing is that instead the person is egocentric themselves, want to solve the problem and wants to find who to blame. And so they blame God. Why did they do all this? And they don't understand what's going on. The reason for the problem is so that they can feel the need deeper, so that it gives them the opportunity to realize that without God's help they can't. But the thing is about that vulnerability and that need, when you need somebody, there's a love there. You know, that need brings you close. That's how human beings are. So it's through the problems that you can become much closer. The tzaddikim, that's why the place where the repentance stand, the righteous can't. Because, like I said, they're given so many good qualities that they can stand on their own sufficiently, that they don't have to reach out to God with the same desperation. And that desperation and that yearning, that unbelievable yearning, that could bring a person much closer in a certain type of way that the righteous can't. Because, well, Chassidus talks about it from this angle, that the righteous, they grow based, like I said, on their own strength that they've been given. And they, of course, they recognize those strengths are from God. And that's fantastic. But still, it's not all. There's always an element of themselves, and it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable because they have come from their own strength, and they have built themselves up. And so that reality is present. On the other hand, when you have a simple Jew that feels lost, you know, all these stories, I don't know if you heard these stories with the Baal Shem Tov, of so many stories about simple Jews crying out to God and how those prayers, you know, undid decrees in heaven against the Jewish people. And you try to understand, how did they do that? How's that possible? But it's a deep humility. You know, it's a deep feeling that, and this is actually one of the verses we're going to come to, God willing, next week, is that it's the feeling that all I have is you. I can't come with everything on my own. All I'm coming is with you. And that is boundless. Because once you're basing anything on only God, you have no rules then. There's no rules then at all. It's not because of me, it's not because of my righteousness, it's not because of how hard I've tried. It's only based on God's mercy. I really have nothing. And the person, it's so easy because it's basically, there's a lot of truth to it. The person realizes that they're on a low level, you know. So, so this relates to the idea of music also. All this that we've been saying, I'm a little bit stream of consciousness here, but you know, music is something that raises a person up, but it also something you do with a partner. You know, it's something that you're led to act and connect with someone. People dance, they hold hands, they dance, and they, you know, they have a partner or they dance in a circle. But the point is, you know, you dance with a partner. So, you know, maybe that's another one of the messages here, is that the Tehillim is often sang with music because God is always our partner. God is always our shepherd and with us. And the idea that the words of Psalms are really music. They are a dance of man with God.